So here's the application we built, this project we worked on, the folder structure you already know. And let's assume that our code is already optimized and that we tested this thoroughly. And therefore, the only thing that's missing is that we deploy this application. Now, before we do that, let me dive into that environment variable thing, which you saw on the slides. And that is a feature that's actually built into every project you build with the Angular CLI. In the source folder, you have your app folder, but there you also have an environments folder. In that environments folder, you have two files, environment.ts and environment.prod.ts. Now, we're not using these files, but what you could do here, you see, you have an exported constant in the environment.ts and in the environment.prod.ts file. It's the same constant with the same name. You can add key value pairs to that constant. For example, if you were using an API that requires some API key, and actually we are using something like this, and hence I will show you how to use this environment variable in a second. If you are using something like this, then you can store that API key here. You can import that environment constant here into your files to use that API key. And what the CLI, the Angular CLI, does for you is that it will automatically swap these two files when you're building for production. So during development, this environment.ts file and the value you have in here will be used. And during production, this constant will be used instead. And this is swapped automatically. You don't need to write any special code for this behavior to occur. Now, why is this useful? Well, you might have certain values that differ from development to production. You might have some API keys that are meant to be used during development, and then you have different keys, which maybe are more restrictive, for production. Or any other value. You can store anything in here, any value which you need in your other files, and you have the option of using different values for production and development. Now, as I mentioned, we are using such an API key. We are using that in our auth service. In the auth service, we're sending requests to the Firebase backend APIs here to sign a new user up or to log a user in. And there I'm referring to that key thing here, right? We're using that Firebase API key here. Check the authentication section where I add this in case you haven't seen this code before. This key is the same here for signing users up and for signing users in. And therefore, we could, of course, manage it in a constant inside of this file. But especially if we were using that in other files as well, it's definitely worth moving that into this environment file in the environments folder. So here I'll name this Firebase API key. The name is totally up to you. And the value is then just that key value here. Now, with that stored in the environment.ts file, we should also copy that into the environment.prod.ts file, because this is the file that will be used when you build for production. And now with these keys added here, you can go back to the auth service, and there you now need to import these environment values. So here you can import environment, which is the name of that exported constant, from, and now you simply point at the environments folder, and there the environment file, not environment prod, but just environment. And again, this will be swapped automatically for you by the Angular CLI when you build for production. Now you can use that environment constant here, and in the places where we are using that key, here for example, you get rid of that key, and instead you add environment.firebase API key to that string, and therefore use that as a key value. The same, of course, here for signing users in. Remove it here and add this environment Firebase API key thing. Now that's a tiny thing, but the advantage here really is that you can swap values from development to production. Here we're not doing that, but of course that would be an option, and it's a powerful tool that can really help you with development. With the environment variables added, it's now time to build the project. And you already saw the command for that. It's ng build --prod. And this builds the entire Angular application for production optimizes everything, and gives you an output which you can deploy onto a static server. Now again, let me highlight here that what this does is it compiles your TypeScript code to JavaScript. That's one important step. It also compiles all your templates to JavaScript instructions so that in the end, only JavaScript code is generated, JavaScript code that runs in the browser and contains all the logic for updating the DOM in the way you defined it in your multiple components and all the logic you added in your application. This is all done by the bundled up application, which takes advantage of the Angular framework that of course powers all of that. Now after running ngbuild prod, you get this dist folder, and in there you have a folder of your project name, and in that project name folder, now you have a bunch of assets that you might have included, and you also got your main polyfill runtime file and a couple of other files. The exact names will differ for you, but you got a couple of JavaScript files which essentially contain your JavaScript code, your Angular app. This is how it looks like in the optimized form. Quite unreadable, right? But that is in the end all the logic of the Angular framework and of your code. And you will find some elements here which you have stored in your template files. So you can definitely also search these files for some snippets of your templates. But this is now the code. So everything in the project name folder, in the dist folder, all of that is the code which you need to deploy. It's the HTML file with a bunch of script imports, as you can see. And these script imports in the end make up all your app that starts. It's all these JavaScript files that make up your app and the style CSS file, which with some general styling, in this case with all the Bootstrap styles. So now we just have to deploy this. How does this work? As I mentioned, you now need a static website host. And of course, there are many options for that. You can Google for static website hosts to find many articles and examples to learn where you can host such a static website. I particularly want to highlight AWS S3, which uses a special service of the AWS, so of the Amazon Web Services, that allows you to host static websites. That is definitely worth a look. You need an AWS account for that, but thereafter it's pretty straightforward to use, pretty powerful and pretty popular. And I also want to point you at Firebase hosting. Now you don't need to have the rest of your backend on Firebase to use that. It's a coincidence that here in this course we used Firebase for the authentication and for the database because it was easy to use and it is intended to be a all-in-one package. But even if you use your own backend or if you use a totally different API, you can always use Firebase hosting to host static websites. And indeed, it is what I want to use here because it's particularly easy to use. Now, here you can learn more about that in the official docs, and you see how you can get started with Firebase hosting. You need the Firebase CLI for that, which simply is a tool you have to install to automatically deploy your Firebase application. For that, you need to install the Firebase CLI first, for which you need Node.js and NPM, which we already got because the Angular CLI needed that as well. And therefore, you can dive right in and run this command to install the Firebase tools, which is the Firebase CLI in the end. So here, in a terminal, doesn't have to be your project terminal here, could be any terminal or command prompt on your machine. You simply run npm install -g firebase -tools. On Mac and Linux, you probably need to add a sudo in front of this to avoid permission errors. And now what this will do is it will install the Firebase CLI on your machine so that you can use it in every project, not just in this project, to deploy an application. So with that all run, you next have to run Firebase login to log into your Firebase account. Now I already am logged in here. If you aren't, you will be prompted for an email and password combination for your Firebase account. So you need a Firebase account for that. If you followed through that course, you probably already have one, or a Google account to be precise. If you followed through the course, you already have one because we used Firebase already. Otherwise, you have to create one or simply look into one of the other static hosts you can use. You find deployment instructions in the official docs of every host, of course. So here we'll continue with Firebase. We logged in. And the next step then is to run Firebase init to connect this project here with one of your Firebase projects. And for that, you now should be in your Angular project folder. So cd into it if you're not using the terminal built into your IDE. Firebase init now asks you what you want to use, so which Firebase feature you want to use, because you could use the Firebase CLI for other things too, not just for hosting. But I'm only interested in hosting, so let's tick that. Side note, we are of course using the database here as well, but we're not using it through the Firebase SDK, so we don't need to add that. As you see, it works without the CLI. For hosting, however, we need the CLI, so tick hosting here by hitting space next to it, and then hit enter. Now you need to choose a project to which you want to connect. And for me, that's this project. Simply choose the project you created for the recipe book. So here we need a Firebase project for the hosting. If you haven't created one yet, you need to create one now. Though, of course, the question then is, where did you store your recipes? But let's now choose this project. Now you're asked what your public directory is. And here you should not use the default, which would be public. But the public directory simply is the directory that contains all your files that you want to deploy. And in our case, that's in a dist folder, this ng complete guide update folder in my case, or whatever this folder name is in your case. So here we want to use dist/ng complete guide update, or whatever folder name you have in the dist folder. So your project name essentially. Now, you're asked whether you want to configure this as a single page app, and you should definitely choose Y for a yes here to ensure that all requests that are sent to that backend are always redirected to index.html, because that is a common gotcha indeed. You need to have a server configured such that it always serves the index.html, no matter which URL you entered into the browser. And the reason for that is that by default, the server always handles an incoming request first. And if it's a URL that's unknown to the server, you would normally get an error. Of course, we have the Angular router handling our different routes, but that, always keep in mind, runs on the client, so in the browser. And that only gets a chance to run if the server serves your app. So any requests have to reach the server first. There, they are all redirected to index.html, which in the end is our starting point for the single page application. And since any request, no matter which URL you entered, reaches that page, that HTML page, now the Angular app can take over for any incoming request with any URL on your server, and can then use the Angular router to load the correct content in your Angular app. That's why this redirection is important. So choose Y for a yes here. Now the existing HTML file should not be overwritten, so choose no here. And with that, you're done. And the next and last step then is that you run Firebase deploy. And this will now deploy the content of this folder onto Firebase. Now, this can take a couple of seconds, so let's wait for this to finish. And once it is done, it should give you a URL where you can find your application. So let's grab that URL and enter it in the browser. And there you should be on your application that should work just the way it worked locally, but now on a real server. And we're still interacting with our backend API and everything, but now this is our deployed application.